I'm Jen Bartel, and I'm going to draw Jem from Jem and the Holograms today. When I first got into comics, it was because of Jem, and it's kind of strange because it wasn't really a property that I grew up with because I was growing up in South Korea, and so I didn't really get exposed to Jem until I was an adult. But I come from an illustration background, and when I was initially asked to draw Jem, I had never worked in comics before. But IDW had picked up the license for a comic book series, and at the time, this was just a couple years ago, it was being written by Kelly Thompson and drawn by Sophie Campbell. My first foray into comics was with Jem. And needless to say, I had to learn a lot about the property after I was already fully in it. I definitely didn't have plans to work in comics when I was first asked to draw Jem. And I thought really that I would do one cover maybe, but one quickly turned into 10, which then turned into 27. Jem from the comics has a slightly different design than the classic one, so she's got these massive star earrings. I think Sophie's the one that gave her those. I don't even think it was really intentional, the color palettes that I use, it's just the stuff that I like personally, and I think being a 90s kid and kind of growing up with Lisa Frank and anime and that sort of aesthetic definitely contributed to just my personal tastes, and so it's a big reason why I use the colors that I do. Well, as far as things went within the comic, I know that Sophie and Kelly, I sort of had a little less to do with this because I was just the cover artist for the majority of the series. But I know that when they were discussing the music element of it, obviously with a comic book, you're not going to have audio, and so unlike the show, they had to come up with a way to really get across that it was music that was happening on the page. And so Sophie actually hand-lettered all of those segments. And then when I eventually ended up doing some interiors, I had to really figure out how I was gonna sort of mimic that. So right now I'm just using a graphite, it's just a mechanical pencil to kind of go in and give myself a little more in terms of guidelines so that when I start inking this, I have a little more to go off of. Last week at Image Expo, my new creator-owned book, Blackbird, was announced, and I've been kind of quietly working on it over the past year, and it has been, comics are really hard. They're really hard. It's so much more laborious than anything that I've had to do in illustration. If you think about what goes into even a basic 6-panel page, that's 6 different illustrations that you're drawing in one page. So the sheer labor has just been a huge learning experience, and I think comic artists are just on another level when it comes to that stuff. All right, so I've got most of my lines kind of in place. I'm gonna actually start inking now. I kind of just see how much ink is coming out of the brush and start wherever it makes sense. It's been really awesome to be in an industry full of people who love what they do. It's rare, and there's a lot of passion in comics. I also think comics is kind of a weird industry compared to illustration because no one really picks up an issue of Business Week because they're a fan of an illustrator, But there are people who will fly to comic conventions to meet their favorite creators. I think you see it more in the music world, with bands, but less so in the visual arts. So that's been really strange and cool. It's been really cool seeing cosplayers. When I design an outfit for a character or something and then seeing people physically come to my table at shows dressed as this thing that I made. There was one recently that was pretty incredible. I did a Jubilee drawing and she was just perfect for it. She just looked to the T like my drawing. When I'm working on paper like this, like if I have the opportunity to lay out a sketch digitally, I will, because I think the hardest thing is composition. It's making sure that the image is like centered where you want it, or, you know, as big on the page as you want it. And sometimes when you're drawing on a page and you start with like just a head, you know, or you start with a face, there's a lot of artists that do that because I think faces are fun to draw, and universally people enjoy drawing them. And like when I work, if I can ink digitally, if the deadline will accommodate that, because it does take a little more time to work traditionally. I always want to because I enjoy it. But even when I work traditionally, I will always try to do my sketch digitally, and then I'll like light box it or print it out in like blue ink, ink on top of that. Jem is, for those of you who don't know, the holographic alter ego of a character named Jerrica. And Jerrica is extremely shy, and she kind of has stage fright, and she's very quiet, and she's basically the total opposite of Jem. So Jem is how she gets to kind of come out of her shell a little bit, and so you always want Jem to look confident and happy. I think, you know, when characters exude confidence, they're always kind of open, and Jerrica was always drawn very closed off, like arms crossed, hands folded, lots of things like that, to kind of drive home that she was a shy character. I took a little bit of creative freedom when I took over doing the Jem covers, but I tried to stay as true to Sophie's designs as possible, because I think those designs really resonated with the fans. And one thing that she was really good about doing is setting up these kind of motifs for each of the bands. In the holograms, it was always stars, and so Jem always has stars all over the place. The Misfits, their sort of rival band, it's all lightning bolts. And so you'll see those symbols on characters. I think it's just icons that help people identify who's who. It's effectively a team book, so there's tons and tons of characters. And I think if you're just glancing at a page, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. So those symbols help. So the reason why I saved the hair for kind of last is because I really like doing hair with a slightly drier brush. Gives me a little more variation. If your brush has too much ink coming out of it, you'll end up with just like really solid, kind of goopy hair. So I always like to wait till it's at about this point, and then I'll come in and get lots of cool texture, and a big piece of that is just the brush is kind of doing that for me. And when the brush gets this dry, it's kind of almost like you're working with graphite in a weird way. I think one of the things I'm known for is post a lot of videos of me working on hair. People always comment on it, and there's something kind of like relaxing about working on this part of it. You know, it's sort of low pressure, just making a lot of lines. All right. Kind of unintentionally, the face got left for the very end. I didn't necessarily mean to do that, but I always end up leaning in really close for the face because it's like the area with the finest detail, you know? So I like to go in and just kind of bring out some areas, and typically I'll use like ink wash to do that, but today I'm using these like water-based markers. They work fine. They get a little streaky sometimes, so they're not my favorite, but for a convention, they're the best because you don't really want to be dealing with like brushes and like inks. So yeah, I don't really have like an exact method to this. I pretty much just am gauging which areas of the image need a little more contrast or need to be brought forward a little more, and that's really all I do. All right. I'm Jen Bartel, and this is Gem.